Welcome in, everybody. Today, we're going to be diving into something pretty big happening out in rural Ontario.
Oh, yeah.
This deal with Elon Musk and his company Starlink to try and get high-speed internet to these like super remote areas.
Right.
We're going off this global news article that has a ton of details on this whole thing.
Yeah, this is a big deal. It's sparked a lot of conversation.
Yeah.
It brings up some questions like why is Ontario choosing to go this way when the federal government under Trudeau is kind of going in a totally different direction?
Right.
And also, how could this deal change how Canada and the US relate, especially with Musk being so close to the Trump administration?
Yeah, there's a lot to break down here. So first off, what are the main parts of this deal?
Well, the Ontario government's putting a good chunk of change behind this $100 million to partner up with Starlink, and the goal is to get high-speed internet to something like 15,000 homes and businesses in these harder-to-reach spots by June 2025. What's interesting is that this isn't Starlink's first time trying to get internet access going in Canada. They had a successful trial run with the Pikangikum First Nation back in 2020.
Oh, okay. So they've got some experience with this kind of thing already.
Right.
But what makes this deal so different from what we're seeing the federal government do? Because it seems like everyone's trying to fix this digital divide thing these days, right?
Yeah, that's the big phrase right there, the digital divide. It's basically that gap between people who have solid high-speed internet and those who don't. And that gap often goes right through rural areas and groups that are kind of left behind. So while the feds have been putting a lot of money into fiber optic networks, those physical cables to deliver internet, Ontario's taking the satellite path with Starlink.
Okay, so they're trying different things, but like, what does that actually mean for people? Why would Ontario go for what seems like a quicker solution with Starlink? And why hasn't Trudeau jumped on this too?
Those are good questions. From what we're seeing, the Canadian government's got a different game plan. They're really focused on building those fiber optic networks and supporting other satellite internet companies too. It's almost like they're thinking long term, like building infrastructure versus Ontario going for a solution right now.
So it's like they're choosing between building a really strong base for the future,
Exactly.
and Ontario's just kind of putting a Band-Aid on it for the moment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And there are definitely good things about both ways. Fiber optic takes longer to set up, but it's super reliable. In fact, a satellite internet, like what Starlink does, can be set up way faster, which is
Mm,
great for places that need internet like yesterday.
right.
But there's a trade-off. Satellite internet can be messed up by weather, and it has higher latency, which means there's a tiny delay when data's moving around. You probably won't notice it just browsing online, but it can be a problem for stuff like video calls or if you're gaming online.
So Ontario's getting things up and running faster, but maybe they're sacrificing quality later on.
Maybe. It's all about what's most important and what those communities actually need. And it makes you wonder about what happens down the road. Who's going to take care of all that satellite stuff? What if Starlink decides to jack up their prices later? These are things Ontario's going to have to figure out.
For sure. Now, let's talk about the big guy in the room, or I guess the rocket in space. In this case, Elon Musk. He's a super interesting guy, and let's be real, sometimes a bit controversial too.
Yeah.
How does him being part of this deal make things more complicated, especially when you think about his connection to Donald Trump and how that all plays into U.S.-Canada relations?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, right? Musk, the CEO of SpaceX and the brains behind Starlink, is also a close advisor to Trump. And Trump, well, he hasn't always been the best friend to Canada, especially when it comes to trade.
To put it lightly,
Yeah.
yeah, he was all about putting those tariffs on stuff coming from Canada.
Exactly.
So how does this deal fit into all of that? Is Ontario kind of playing with fire, partnering up with a company so close to someone who's been critical of Canada?
It's definitely something people are arguing about. Some say Ontario is putting their money at risk by siding with Musk and by connection Trump. They're worried about what might happen with those tariffs, especially if the U.S. decides to get tougher on trade.
But Ontario seems pretty sure about this whole thing, don't they?
Yeah, Premier Doug Ford's been downplaying those tariff threats.
Mm.
He seems to think this deal is what's best for people in Ontario and that it won't mess up their relationship with the U.S.
Okay, so that's the political side of things. But let's get back to the people this is supposed to help. What are the good things that could come out of this for everyday Ontarians living in those remote areas? And are there any downsides we haven't talked about yet?
Well, think about what it would actually mean to have good internet in those places. It's not just about watching Netflix faster, although that's always a plus.
Yeah, sure.
It's about kids being able to get to educational stuff online, even if they're far from schools, or people not having to drive for hours just to talk to a doctor.
Real-
It could open up a lot of chances for people to work from anywhere and connect with people all over the world.
That's a good point. It's about making things fairer for everyone and giving people the tools they need to actually do well in these communities.
Exactly. And it's not just about individuals either. Think about small businesses out there. They could connect with customers anywhere, grow their business, and actually compete with bigger companies. It could really bring life back to those places and make things more equal for everyone.
I see what you mean. So there's a lot of good that could come out of this. But I'm guessing there are also some worries. We've already talked about how it could affect things between Canada and the US and how much Ontario is relying on just Starlink.
Yeah.
Are there any other downsides we need to be thinking about?
Oh, for sure. One thing this global news article doesn't really talk about is how affordable this is going to be. Will everyone in these communities be able to pay for it even if they don't have a lot of money?
Yeah,
Or is this going to create a whole new digital divide where only the people who can afford it get to be connected? That's something Ontario needs to explain.
right. And what about keeping our information private? We're basically handing over a lot of personal stuff to a private company.
Yeah.
Is there any way to know for sure they'll keep our data safe?
That's another really good point. We need to make sure there are strict rules in place to make Starlink handle our data responsibly and be open about it. We also got to think about what happens if Starlink gets too powerful. If they become the only internet game in town, will that stop other companies from coming in and trying to do things better? These are all things we need to be looking into.
It sounds like there's a lot more to this than we first thought.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting people online. It's about dealing with a whole mess of political, economic, and social stuff.
Absolutely. And it shows how important it is to have these discussions to weigh the good and the bad and to make sure our leaders are making choices that actually benefit everyone.
So what do we do now? What should people listening be thinking about after hearing all this?
Well, I think the first thing is to realize there's no easy answer. The Fed's way of doing things and Ontario's way both have good and bad sides. It's about figuring out what those are and deciding what's best for each community. And it's about talking about it locally, fighting for what you need, and making sure your voice is heard.
It sounds like this whole deal has really opened up a can of worms about the future of internet access, not just in Ontario, but maybe across Canada and even the world.
It's like a small example of a much bigger debate about how technology fits into our lives, how to balance what the government does with what private companies do, and how to make sure everyone has access to the important things. And that debate's only going to get bigger as tech keeps changing faster and faster.
So even though this deal might seem like something just happening in Ontario, it actually points to some much bigger ideas and problems that we're all facing in a world where everything's connected.
Yeah. Exactly. And it shows how important it is for people to be informed and willing to talk about these complicated issues and help shape how technology develops in a way that's good for everyone. Because in the end, it's not just about being able to get online. It's about connecting with each other and building a better future that works for all of us.
Yeah, it's crazy how one deal can make us think about so many things, like internet access technology and even how countries get along.
It really shows you how connected all this stuff is. And
Yeah.
it brings us back to that first question we had. Why didn't Trudeau and the feds just go with Starlink for all of Canada?
Right. If it works for Ontario, why not just do it for the whole country? Is it just that they have different ideas about how to do it, or is there something else going on?
It's probably a mix of things. Like we said, the federal government's been spending a lot on those long-term fiber optic cables. They're thinking that in the end, that's going to be a stronger solution that lasts longer for everyone.
So they're thinking way ahead, trying to build something that'll really last. But what about the people who need help right now? Is it fair to make them wait while those cables get put in place?
That's the tough part, isn't it? You always have to think about what people need now and what's best for the future. And it's not just about the technology, it's about making sure that whatever they choose is going to work for a long time and that it's fair for everyone.
So it's back to that balancing act, what we need now versus what we're hoping for later on. And of course, there's always the question of money.
Exactly. Setting up fiber optic cables for the whole country is a huge job. It takes a ton of work and a ton of money.
Yeah.
And even though Starlink might seem cheaper at first, there are still those questions about how much it'll cost down the line and who's actually going to pay for it.
So it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But it's clear that both the federal government and the provinces want to close that digital divide, even if they're going about it in different ways.
And that's where people like us come in. We have to stay involved, ask those tough questions, make sure our leaders are making decisions that are good for everybody.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's a one thing you hope people listening will take away from all this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that technology isn't just this neutral thing. It's shaped by politics, by money, and by what we value as a society. The choices we make about technology today are going to have a huge impact on the world we live in tomorrow.
So whether it's about internet access in Ontario or anything else new that comes along,
Yeah.
we need to look at these things carefully. We can't just ask, can we do this? But also, should we do this? And
Right.
who's actually going to benefit from this?
Exactly. We got to look past all the hype and the cool new gadgets and really think about what this means for the long haul.
Well said. So we'll leave everyone with this one last thought. The future of technology isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create by the decisions we make and the conversations we have. So be curious, stay informed, and stay involved. Because we all have a part to play in shaping the future.